So everyone, thanks for joining. We had quite a few folks sign up for this presentation, and I think it's going to be a really good one. We have Kathy Shebus from the Special Application Center and Jane Hornstein, the director of the Special Application Center. So we have the exact right people to present on this topic of streamlined voluntary conversion today. So I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions, or we're going to be going over quite a bit of material today. And so we'll leave quite a bit of time at the end for any questions that anyone in the audience has. Next slide, please. Okay, so why are we here? Hopefully you realize that this was a streamlined voluntary conversion presentation. We are, this is one in a series of our Wednesday webinars where we try to break down the components or different strategies in the repositioning process, and this is one of our tools in the repositioning toolbox. So today we're going to talk about, within streamlined voluntary conversion, which PHAs are eligible and some of the key program features. Kathy is going to get in-depth in some of these more complicated or frequently asked about program features. We're going to also talk about the application process and the order of operations. So this is when a PHA makes that decision that they do want to convert under streamlined voluntary conversion, how do they go about doing it? And then lastly, we'll talk through some of the scenarios in which a housing authority might decide to utilize streamlined voluntary conversion. So I guess I would say in lieu of case studies, we'll talk about sort of the different flavors of streamlined voluntary conversion. Next slide, please. And just to orient everyone, and in case you missed any of our previous Wednesday webinar topics and you want to go back to them, our initial Developing a Repositioning Strategy webinar is online and available on the HUD Exchange, and that's a great starting spot if you want to learn all about repositioning and how you make the decision to which strategy makes the most sense for you. And I also want to just flag for you that we have a new webinar that we just established, or we just set up on dispositions proceeds in the middle of October. So be on the lookout for that one. And I also wanted to flag the project-based voucher overview webinar that we're going to have in December. So a lot of folks that are converting or thinking about converting under streamlined voluntary conversion are going to have some overlap with that project-based voucher overview. So make sure that you also tune into that one, because there'll be quite a bit of intersection between the two of those. Okay, so we've really tried to put a lot of materials, we at HUD have really tried to put a lot of materials together for folks considering repositioning. We have the repositioning website, which is our first link there, which is sort of our clearinghouse for everything. And I'll just put a note out there that we're working to clean that up a little bit so that it's a little bit more user-friendly, but for the most part, you can navigate from there to anything you need regarding any question you have with repositioning. And we have an email inbox that goes to a real live person, which is me, repositioning@hud.gov, and we'll provide that at the end. So if you can't find anything on the website, feel free to reach out to me. And then just quickly, if you want a more in-depth discussion on repositioning, the Introduction to Repositioning webinar series was a four-part, 4-day-long training where it's a deep dive into all the repositioning options. Excellent. Okay, so we built a little repetition into this presentation today because I think it's going to help it sink in a little bit to the listeners, and some of this stuff is complex. So I want to start with our high-level background. Why are we here? What are some of the basic, most important takeaways for streamlined voluntary conversion? So first off, what is it, right? So when we talk about repositioning, as we talked about in the previous webinars, that's really converting your Section 9 public housing to Section 8, and in this case, tenant-based assistance. So Section 22 really, or streamlined voluntary conversion, is really talking about converting to tenant-based assistance. And the key element of streamlined voluntary conversion, which is an update to voluntary conversion, is that streamlined voluntary conversion waives the conversion assessment, making it easier for housing authorities to under 250 units to convert. And so, and I would just say that the most important element of this conversion assessment, or the one that tripped, or that was an impediment for housing authorities to convert under voluntary conversion before, was the cost test. And so, okay, so 3 major takeaways about streamlined voluntary conversion. So in order for a housing authority to be eligible, or sorry, in order for units to be eligible, converted units to be eligible for tenant protection vouchers, they needed to be occupied within the past 24 months of Streamlined Voluntary Conversion approval, right? So an assisted family must have lived there within the past 2 years. Next, the housing authority that converts under Streamlined Voluntary Conversion can project base those units with tenant consent, but ultimately, or statutorily, the right to the vouchers is with the tenant. Right, so bear that in mind, that does add a complication to the project basing of the units when you convert. And lastly, a housing authority must commit to closing out their public housing program. So that means that you cannot develop any new, if you convert through Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, the housing authority that does that may not redevelop units with any remaining fair clause authority, right? You're saying to HUD, I'm getting out of public housing and I'm only going to operate a voucher program. There are things you can do with the fair class units that remain in your program. You can transfer them in accordance with the closeout notice PIH 2019-13, but just the key takeaway for you is I'm doing Streamlined Voluntary Conversion. It means I'm getting out of the public housing business. Next slide. Okay, and so Kathy's main discussion today is going to be some of the highlights of what we call the order of operations document, which is the order in which your housing authority is going to approach the conversion. And we have, laid out in a very handy and relatively concise document, the order of operations. And once your housing authority makes the decision that you do want to convert, we have what's known as the Streamlined Voluntary Conversion checklist. And so that's, enables you to make sure you've done everything to make sure your application to the SAC, when you're submitting that application to the SAC for conversion, is complete. And within the next, I'll say, several weeks, we're going to have field staff trained to assist your housing authority putting that package together. We're training a team of folks known as expediters in the field offices who can look over your package and make sure that your Streamlined Voluntary Conversion application is buttoned up and more likely to be approved by the SAC. Okay, turning it over to Kat.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. So my name again is Kathy Shebist. I'm a program analyst in the Special Application Center. So I'm going to transition from where Dan left off with kind of the big picture, the threshold criteria for when HUD will approve a Housing Authority Streamlined Voluntary Conversion Plan. So the important thing to keep in mind here is that even though housing authorities with 250 or fewer public housing units, every single public housing authority with that inventory who agrees to close out is eligible to apply for Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, it's not an automatic approval if you have that unit count. SAC is going to look holistically at housing authorities' SVC plans. We're going to look at the impact of ending a public housing program in a community, the impact of expanding a housing authority's HCV program, and what that could look like in the local market if the plan is to voucher out. And we're going to look at the proposed future use of the property. So we're really going to take it all into account as we review these plans. And the housing authorities really need to evidence that the plan is in the best interest of their residents, the PHA itself, and the overall community. And we're going to be looking for supporting documentation and evidence, including what the market looks like for taking in those voucher holders, the landlord supply, the access to schools, jobs, transportation, and then looking at the future use and what's going on with the project. We're also going to be considering the public comments, including resident comments, in the review of the conversion plan, if any were submitted to the Housing Authority, and won't approve a conversion plan until we're satisfied that the resident and public concerns have been adequately addressed by the PHA in developing the final plan. Okay, we can go into the next slide. So this slide is just an overview of the major components of the Streamlined Voluntary Conversion Plan, which include the impact analysis, the impact on the neighborhood, the future use of the property, the relocation plan, resident and local government consultation, and then kind of a summary and a totality that all of that benefits the PHA community and won't have an adverse impact on affordable housing in the community. Now, after you review the checklist, if you haven't already, you'll see that the checklist has requests and requires considerably more information than these 5 things, and that is just to ensure that the SAC also has the required additional information to process an SVC plan and application, including things like evidence of PHA plan, board resolution, environmental review, a description of the property, all of those kind of administrative housekeeping things. But these are the 5 regulatory components of a Streamlined Voluntary Conversion Plan. And we're going to get into these in a little more depth in the next slides. Okay, so the next thing is impact analysis. So what we're really looking at here is what will the impact on the neighborhood be from the conversion. So we're looking for housing authorities to submit a narrative here discussing the impact on the availability of affordable housing in the neighborhood, the impact on the concentration of poverty in the neighborhood, and other substantial impacts on the neighborhood. Now, if the future use of the property is going to remain affordable rental housing for the same income targeted families, 80% and below of area median income, there may be very little impact on the neighborhood under any of these factors. But regardless, we're going to want to see some kind of description. And even if the future use of the property will remain affordable rental housing, there could be some discussion on the long-term positive impacts of that by having sufficient cash flow to operate and maintain the property as affordable housing, possibly improve it, possibly develop, excess land around it, or add more units, or whatever you can do to that might improve the neighborhood based on the conversion from public housing. Okay, next slide is the future use of the property. So here, conversion, I just want to clarify first that conversion as defined by the statute and the reg means conversion of the assistance of the families from public housing. And the future use of the property, of the real estate, of the dirt, in essence, is definitely part of the Streamlined Voluntary Conversion Plan, but that isn't really part of the threshold criteria, unlike maybe a demolition or disposition where we're really looking more to what's happening with the real estate. That said, we want you to have a kind of concrete and well-developed plan for the future use of the property. In some instances, it might be demolition only. A housing authority might say, conversion really makes sense here to convert the residents and the families under this authority, but we're not quite sure what we're going to do long-term with this property in terms of redevelopment or sale. So right now, we just want HUD authority to demolish the property with cap funds, and we want to retain the dirt, the real estate, under the declaration of trust until we kind of come up with a more concrete sale or redevelopment plan. And that is okay. We would accept that under a Streamlined Voluntary Conversion Plan. More frequently, a housing Housing Authority will propose either a disposition or a retention of the property in order for the DOT to be released at the time of the conversion of the families to Section 8. For dispositions, we can approve dispositions as part of the Streamlined Voluntary Conversion Plan. All of the technical requirements of Section 18 disposition do not apply. However, we'll generally be using the same standards of commensurate public benefit for below fair market value dispositions, and we will be looking for some kind of good cause or commensurate public benefit, generally the continued use of the property as affordable rental housing in order to approve a below fair market value transfer. As with Section 18, the transfer can be to any entity, and there's even more flexibility in terms of transfers under Streamlined Voluntary Conversion than there are under 18. It can be an entity completely controlled by the Housing Authority, a nonprofit, or an LLC. Important, too, for fair market value dispositions is if you do realize proceeds, then statutorily, those are restricted for Section 18 eligible uses. So although all of the Section 18 disposition requirements don't apply to dispositions under a Streamlined Voluntary Conversion Plan, any proceeds are statutorily restricted to Section 18 uses. So we're hoping to publish a notice on eligible uses of Section 18 proceeds in the next week, so that will definitely provide additional guidance on this topic. But generally, proceeds from a Section 18 disposition or Section 22 conversion can be used for low-income housing under the 37 Act. So really any Section 9 purposes or in many Section 8 purposes. So here, housing authorities, because they're closing out their public housing programs, the uses of Section 18, the uses for Section 9 public housing purposes will be limited, but housing authorities can use proceeds for many Section 8 uses, including the development of PBV housing or in other ways to supplement their HCV programs. So the other big bucket for kind of removing the DOT other than disposition would be a retention. And this is possible, again, under a Streamlined Voluntary Conversion Plan. A housing authority could say to HUD in their application, we plan to retain the property as affordable rental housing outside of the public housing restrictions after the conversion. One of the tricky things here is the families have the statutory right to stay in their units using tenant-based assistance, which will require a HAP execution, and a housing authority can't sign both sides of the HAP contract. So if a retention is proposed and the plan is to retain the property as affordable rental housing, the housing authority will need to come up with some kind of contractual relationship with an entity to sign the HAP as project owner, so it could sign the other side of the HAP as HCV administrator. But I think that's a hurdle that many housing authorities are figuring out how to overcome. So a retention is possible even when the planned future use is affordable rental housing. Housing authority, especially if they have different locations, different properties on different parcels, can propose different future uses for different properties. So this is at a local discretion. A housing authority could sell some units on the open market at fair market value and then transfer others to an affiliate entity at below fair market value for the continued use as affordable housing. So it doesn't have to be one future use and one acquiring entity for all the units. And similarly, if there are different properties and different feature uses and a housing authority has limited capacity or otherwise wants to space out the conversion of the properties based on, you know, the private market and being able to absorb all the families or other issues, they can propose different timelines in terms of starting the relocation and doing the conversion for the different sites. Finally, as part of a property description and describing the future use, a housing authority can include non-dwelling property like non-dwelling buildings or vacant land or personal property as part of the Streamlined Voluntary Conversion Plan and property description if that non-dwelling property and personal property supports and is directly related to the units being converted and the future use of those units that's described. Okay, next slide is the relocation plan. So we get a lot of questions on relocation, and it's tricky. There's a lot of issues here. One of the most fundamental issues is and a point of confusion for many is displacement of families that are being removed or are being converted from public housing are considered displaced families for purposes of Section 22. So even if a housing authority is going to retain the property as affordable housing through an affiliate or themselves and allow the families to remain in place with tenant-based or possibly project-based assistance, those families are still considered displaced families under the 1937 Act. So that means a few things. It means that those families are entitled to a 90-day notice informing them that they will be removed and their unit will be converted from the public housing program, even if, again, they're not physically required to move. And then if the family is being offered tenant-based assistance, those families are also entitled to the PHA paying their moving expenses because, again, they're being displaced from the public housing program and they need to be fully protected in terms of the ability to use the tenant-based assistance. So backtracking a little bit, so again, threshold, concern, criteria with developing a relocation plan is every single family being converted from public housing is considered a displaced family and entitled to a 90-day notice, an offer of comparable housing, and the PHA paying their moving expenses if they're being offered tenant-based assistance, or really any assistance. PHA has to pay the moving expenses for all displaced families. Section 22 requires housing authorities to offer families comparable housing. The regulation and the statute describe three possible forms of comparable housing, tenant-based assistance, project-based assistance, or a unit operated or assisted by a PHA at a comparable rental rate. Because conversions generally come with an award of tenant protection vouchers, and families are entitled to receive that tenant protection voucher, the comparable housing will almost always be an offer of tenant-based assistance in the form of the tenant protection voucher. Certain times, over-income families, and in other instances, a housing authority might offer a family another form of comparable housing, like a unit operated or assisted by the PHA. But generally, the comparable housing is in the form of tenant-based assistance. If the property will be operated as rental housing after the conversion, the family is entitled to stay in their unit using that tenant-based assistance, or is entitled to take that tenant-based assistance and move off-site, again, with the PHA paying the family's moving expenses. And then, go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that to make sure people understand. Because residents are being displaced from the public housing program, based on URA, General Counsel has ruled that that means they are displaced. Therefore, if they choose to move at that time, PHAs must pay the relocation cost. If they choose to stay and move 6 months later, then they pay their own cost. But if they choose to move at the time of the displacement, the PHAs must pay the moving cost. I just want to stress that. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, that is, it's a key and important point. Again, all families are displaced. When they're offered tenant-based assistance, they can stay if the project will be used as rental housing, or they can move. If they choose to move at the time of conversion, the PHA must pay actual and reasonable relocation expenses. Now, there's some flexibility and local discretion for what actual and reasonable relocation expenses covers. Clearly, actual moving expenses, but then there's some local discretion there in terms of other expenses. For instance, a PHA may, but is not required to pay for things like security and utility deposits. And a PHA may, but is not required to pay for long-distance moves if a family would choose to port out their voucher to another community. But again, if the family, as Jane stressed, opts to take their tenant-based assistance and move off-site, then the housing authority is obligated to pay actual and reasonable relocation expenses. So just to walk through an example, in the situation where a housing authority is proposing to retain a property as affordable rental housing, the housing authority would need to offer the family 3 relocation choices. Retain the property as affordable rental housing and has plans to PBV the unit, and those PBV the project, the housing authority would need to offer the families 3 forms of relocation or comparable housing. They would need to offer the family, 1, the ability to stay in their units using tenant-based assistance, 2, the ability to move off-site with the tenant-based assistance with the housing authority paying the moving expenses, and 3, the ability to stay in their units using project-based assistance, provided the family provides their informed written consent, which we'll get to in a slide in a minute. And if the family does choose to move or even chooses to stay, housing authorities are also obligated to provide necessary relocation counseling to families. This generally will be mobility counseling, but it could be any counseling that the family requires as part of the relocation. So moving on to a couple other little things with relocation. If a housing authority is proposing redevelopment of the property after or in conjunction with the conversion, for instance, a demolition and new construction through an AHAP process, then the housing authority needs to think about the impact of that on the families. When will the families be physically displaced? If it's after conversion, in conjunction with the conversion, how is that going to intersect with the offer of permanent comparable housing and the family's relocation? So we're still at HUD internally circulating a couple of these issues, but I just wanted to flag it as something housing authorities really need to start planning for early on when a conversion plan contemplates redevelopment of the property. Eligible sources of relocation funding include capital funds and gross proceeds, as well as other available non-federal funds. And for certain expenses, operating funds can also be used. Those are mostly for administrative cost of the relocation plan and not so much for the moving cost. And finally, I wanted to address URA applicability. Unlike Section 18, there's no statutory exemption from the URA with Section 22's. Section 22 and the 972 reg say the URA may apply. So again, there's no clear black and white lines here, but it's really the URA test. So to the extent that the families will be displaced as a direct result of the demo, acquisition, or rehab of a federally assisted property converted under a SVC plan, then the URA applies. So, you know, housing authorities, again, need to think through what kind of funding they're using and if their future use plans involve demo, acquisition, or rehab to the extent that the URA may be triggered. You know, HUD has relocation specialists available, and the SAC and the URA specialists in the field office can work with the housing authority to figure out the applicability of URA as part of an SVC. Okay, let's go on to the next slide.
So we actually had a few questions that came in about the URA, so I think if
Sure.
If you're okay, we can go ahead and take some of those. All right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So first question, is the assistance equivalent to URA relocation assistance? You might have that person type in a clarification if you need it.
Right. Well, I can start addressing it, and then they can they can include a clarification. So, I think it's similar. The notice requirements are a little different under just if URA does not apply. There's only the requirement for one notice, with this one 90-day notice that housing authorities will provide to families after HUD issues the approval that notify them again that their public housing unit lease is going away and they're being converted to HCV, the kind of just the 90-day notice of the conversion. And so there's no GIN notice under Section 22 requirements. And similarly, under Section 22, there's the requirement that the housing authority offer comparable housing, generally in the form of tenant-based assistance. Or another form of comparable housing, and there's no option to provide the URA payment as a form of comparable housing. So that's different. There's no money assistance. It's just an offer of one of these hard forms of comparable housing. I think those are the principal differences. So again, a little different, but a lot of similarities. And in terms of relocation cost, I think under the URA, housing authorities there's no ability to provide for security or utility deposits, but under the Section 22 language of actual and reasonable relocation expenses, there's a little more flexibility for housing authorities, and they can provide for those kinds of expenses should they choose to do so.
Okay, thanks. So next question, are the PHAs to follow the URA with relocation of these households? I think you might have already answered that, but just want to
so URA, again, may be triggered depending on the use of federal funds for the acquisition, rehab, or demolition of the project. Work with field office, URA specialists at HUD internally to figure out if URA is triggered. I think most of the plans we're seeing so far are not triggering the URA. So if the URA is not triggered, then in lieu of the URA, housing authorities will follow the relocation requirements outlined in 972.230G.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Can a PHA, go ahead. Jane.
I was going to clarify just one more thing. The only way URA is triggered is by whatever financing they're using in any kind of renovation or new development. So if they're using other federal funds, CDBG, home, et cetera, that will trigger the URA. Section 32 on, or Section 22 on its own does not.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. So, you know, the use of, it's the use of certain federal funds for the demolition, acquisition, or rehab as part of the future use. But the conversion, the removal from public housing in and of itself will not trigger the URA. Instead, the relocation requirements in 972 apply.
Okay, next question. Can a PHA opt to keep some properties as traditional public housing units and convert other public housing properties via the voluntary conversion? Does this program require 100% conversion of an entire public housing portfolio?
Yes, that's a good question, and I think that was part of the threshold criteria that kind of Dan outlined right before he handed the slide deck over to me. But Streamlined Voluntary Conversion requires the housing authority to convert every last one of its Section 9 public housing units. It's not possible under a Streamlined Voluntary Conversion plan to say, I have 230 units, I'm going to convert 200 of them and keep 30 as public housing. The Streamlined Voluntary Conversion plan has to propose a future use and conversion of every single property and every single unit.
Okay, thanks. Next question, is the PHA required to use independent third-party relocation counseling, or can the PHA use its Section 8 administrator to perform these services?
Local discretion. Housing authorities, if they have the capacity to develop and administer a relocation plan, can absolutely do it in-house. There's no requirement to hire third-party relocation specialists or consultants or implementers.
Okay, just a few more. Is there an increase in housing costs once the tenant moves? Will they be able to get URA relocation assistance at 42 months?
Not unless the URA is triggered. So that's an excellent point. It is possible that a voluntary conversion action, moving a family from the public housing program to the HCV program, the tenant might see an increase in rent, particularly if the family is paying a flat rent under the public housing program, and their rent might go up under the HCV program even if they're paying the 30% allotment that's required under the HCV program. So in that instance, no, you wouldn't be able to supplement with the supplement, the URA supplement, unless he did so with non-federal funds or something like that, and did it outside of the Section 22 relocation process, and that was just a local side agreement that the housing authority wanted to do for the family. But federal funds couldn't be used as part of the relocation process unless the housing authority somehow deemed that additional money to the family as being an actual and reasonable relocation expense. But it sounds like a stretch if it's just to supplement rent for a period.
Okay. So if you use a staggered timeline for the conversion, how long would the potential timeline be for that conversion?
Jane, chime in here, but SAC will review that on a case-by-case basis. You know, I don't think we want to see these extending, 5 or 10 years, but I think a reasonable staggered timeline could be acceptable depending on the number of properties and if the housing authority is proposing, to tenant-based to the community and doesn't want to overwhelm or saturate the market at the same time with all the families.
Yeah, I would think 24 months is a reasonable time frame. from start to finish. But there's nothing that, there's no statute or reg that says it has to be done with any period of time. So they vary. But I think normally we would expect to see it completed within 24 months.
All right, I think we have a few more in the queue, but I think we'll hold off and continue for the presentation right now.
Okay.
Okay. So the next slide is the family briefing slide. So this is only applicable if the SVC plan and the Housing Authority proposes to PBV, attach project-based voucher assistance to the project in conjunction with or after the conversion. So in this instance, if a Housing Authority wants to attach PBV assistance to a project, they need to obtain tenant consent for any occupied units. Before attaching such PBV assistance to the units. So again, as we discussed in the relocation slide, families have the statutory right to stay in their units using tenant-based assistance. Housing Authority can certainly offer them the ability to give up that right and instead accept their unit under a PBV lease. But in order to obtain that tenant consent, the Housing Authorities need to hold a family briefing in which they explain to families the differences between the tenant-based and project-based program, and so that the family can fully consent to the PBV lease should they choose to do so. The requirements for that family briefing are outlined in Appendix A of the notice, 2019-05, so I encourage you to read that very carefully. And you'll also note that the field office staff is required to attend those family briefings, either in person or, in the age of this pandemic, virtually is fine as well. Even without the pandemic, field offices can attend the family briefing virtually. We've also discussed some flexibility, like a Housing Authority could have one big meeting, one family briefing meeting where they invite everyone, either virtually or in person, and then the field office attends that. But then if they want to have individual meetings or subsequent meetings, or if families didn't attend that first meeting, and the field office wouldn't have to attend each and every one of the individual meetings as long as they're invited to and attend a main briefing meeting that's kind of a public meeting with some or all of the families. The timing of the family briefing, there's flexibility there. The briefing, the meeting, can occur before or after the Housing Authority submits the SVC plan and application to HUD. If this occurs before the Housing Authority submits the application and before the family or the PHA issues the family the 90-day relocation notice, then at the briefing, the Housing Authority should really explain to the family the totality of their relocation rights, not just the difference between a PBV lease and a TBV lease in their units, but also explain that they're also going to have the option to move off-site with tenant-based assistance, and the Housing Authority will pay the moving expenses. The family must be provided with at least 30 days from that briefing before they're required to make a decision on whether they're going to accept a PBV lease or opt for a tenant-based lease to stay in their unit or to move off-site. But in addition to that 30-day requirement, the Housing Authority also has to comply with that 90-day notice that we discussed in terms of the relocation. So SAC is recommending that Housing Authorities not accept the family's written consent as to which option to take, PBV lease or tenant-based assistance, until after HUD approves the SVC plan and after the Housing Authority issues the 90-day notice. So in other words, family briefing, the meeting with the families, explaining their options can occur at any time, but in order for the family to fully understand their relocation options, we think it's a best practice that housing authorities not accept a family's written consent until after the approval and the issuance of the 90-day notice. However, it's not regulatory, it's not in the notice, but we're just encouraging that as a best practice. And again, if families opt to accept the written consent prior to that, again, it needs to be a fully conformed written consent to accept the PBV unit, and a family must really understand that they're not only giving up the tenant-based assistance in their unit, but they're also giving up the ability to move off-site with the tenant-based assistance, with the PHA paying for those moving costs at that one-time opportunity to move, with the housing authority paying. Okay, moving on. Resident and local government consultation. The SVC plan needs to be developed with the significant participation of the residents. So the participatory requirements are a little more extensive for SVC and resident engagement even than they are with Section 18. Section 18 requires PHAs to consult with the residents, the resident council, and the RAB. Under Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, the Streamlined Voluntary Conversion plan needs to be developed with the significant participation of the residents. So this requires at least one resident meeting that's separate from the PHA plan meeting, where the Housing Authority provides draft copies of the SVC plan to the residents and the resident council, if any, and explains the SVC requirements and resident rights. The one place where Section 22 is maybe a little more lenient is PHAs don't need to consult separately with the RAB on the SVC plan, as long as they're engaging with the residents of the development and the resident councils of the development in developing the SVC plan. Housing authorities need to tell the families that they have the right to submit comments to the Housing Authority about the plan, and then the Housing Authority needs to provide those comments and their responses to those comments to HUD as part of the SVC plan submission. So between the PHA plan requirements and the voluntary conversion resident consultation requirements here, HUD expects PHAs to undertake good faith efforts to ensure that the residents understand and have a voice in the implementation of voluntary conversions. So I think the statutory and regulatory intent is really clear that we really expect residents to be engaged in the Streamlined Voluntary Conversion planning and implementation process. Housing authorities also need to engage and consult with the local government. This can be part of the consultation with the consolidated plan, and a housing authority can obtain a certification from the local government that says the conversion plan is consistent with the jurisdiction's consolidated plan, and HUD will accept that as sufficient for consultation with the local government. Alternatively, as with Section 18, we'll also accept a separate letter from the mayor that indicates and expresses the local government support of the Housing Authority Streamlined Voluntary Conversion Plan, including the closeout of the public housing program. Okay, next slide. So here we're just this is kind of the recap. Dan referred to this early on. This just lays out sequentially the major steps necessary in preparing and submitting the SVC plan and application. Number 1 and 4 are the consultation requirements we just referred to. The other big things that housing authorities need to plan for before submitting the application are getting the environmental review done. Possibly it'll be categorically excluded or exempt under Part 58, but the paperwork still needs to be done by the responsible entity. So that might take a little time in planning. The SVC plan needs to be included in and part of an annual plan. So again, it should do more than just say, hey, we're planning on voluntary converting the remainder of our units. It should be more than a one sentence. It should kind of provide a thorough description of the SVC plan to satisfy the inclusion requirement. The checklist kind of gives an overview of the major components of the SVC plan. I also talked about it earlier on the slide deck, I think slide number 9 or 10, those 5 major components of the SVC plan. What's included in the annual plan should really touch on all of those elements. What else is important here? Board approval obviously needs to be obtained before submitting the application to the SAC. And then just make sure the required paperwork is filled out, the application forms, and all the other little logistical things on the checklist. And then the Housing Authority can upload all those documents into PIC and hit the submit button, and then SAC's review will begin. We can go on to the next slide. So after SAC reviews and hopefully approves the application, then the Housing Authority can begin the implementation process. Usually the first start of the implementation is the relocation. SAC approval will give the Housing Authority the authority to draw down the TPVs right after approval, but not before 30 to 60 days before the Housing Authority is actually planning on issuing those TPVs to the families and starting the relocation process. And during this time, you know, the Housing Authority can do the family briefings and obtain the tenant consent if it hasn't done already, if the plan is to PBV the project. So this slide just kind of outlines the logistics of things involved in the relocation. Next slide. Continuing after relocation is complete, or maybe in conjunction with the final relocation, if families are remaining in place, the Housing Authority will implement the kind of the final action of the future use, whether it's a demolition, a disposition, or a retention. If it is a disposition or retention, the Housing Authority will submit a draft DOT release to HUD, and the families will, if they're staying in place with HCV assistance, HUD will release the DOT, and move the units into RMI status in PIC. All the families will be EOP'd out of public housing and moved into the 50058 and the HCV program kind of simultaneously. If the property will stay as affordable and the families will stay there with their HCV assistance. And once the property and the units are all out of the PIC system and in RMI status, the conversion is in essence complete, and then the housing authorities will begin working with their field offices to consummate kind of the last aspect of the Streamlined Voluntary Conversion requirements, which is to close out their public housing programs under PH Notice 2019-13. Okay, you're done. Everyone's done. Congratulations on converting your properties. So next slide, other considerations as you think about whether Streamlined Voluntary Conversion makes sense are things like HCV capacity issues. Dan, I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I can just talk about it and give you a breather. That's the mouthful you had there earlier on. So, right, so as we talked about, you're closing out your public housing program and you're converting these units to either tenant-based assistance or project-based assistance or a combination of the two. So as your organization is transitioning, that's something you're going to need to plan for. As you transition from the operator of a public housing project to potentially just a voucher administrator or voucher administrator and owner, and what that looks like for staffing and what that looks like in terms of your ability to operate a now larger voucher program, potentially with 250 or 249 more units under ACC. And the other consideration is project-basing the tenant-based vouchers. Right? Do you currently operate a project-based program, or is that something you need to update your administrative plan with to establish a project-based voucher program? And again, we're just kind of punting it a little bit here on the details of project-basing vouchers for our Wednesday webinar on that topic, but it is something to consider at the outset. Kathy or Jane? Well, I guess, did you want to run through those other ones too?
Thanks, Dan. That made a lot of sense. So I think Dan kind of touched on this already, but another question we get a lot of are, how do we project-base the TPVs? And as Dan said, you know, there's this upcoming webinar on that. So we're going to kind of punt that for the time being. It is possible. We touched on tenant consent as part of this, an earlier slide, but there's also a lot of logistical things involved with planning for the PBV project. So we encourage you to tune into that upcoming webinar for more details on that. Personal property on this other consideration slide. Also touched on that briefly already. If there's snow blowers, vehicles, other personal property that's not part of the real property, it can be included in a streamlined voluntary conversion plan as long as that property supports the real property under the conversion plan. So if a project will be retained as affordable and there's, you know, a vehicle, snow blowers, lawn mowers, all that can be kind of transferred along with the project under the Streamlined Voluntary Conversion Plan. Any personal property that's part of the kind of central office of the Housing Authority's public housing program, that will need to be considered and dealt with as part of the closeout of the public housing program. If it's worth less than $5,000, housing authorities can generally retain or dispose without any HUD approval. So it's not that big of a deal if it is central equipment, but if it is associated with the project, then it might be administratively easier just to include it in the description of the property as part of the SVC plan. 4 on the slide is if you have any EPC or CFFP, capital fund financing program debt, energy performance contract debt with your units or that are proposed for conversion here, you need to think through that, how you plan to resolve that debt, engage the lenders, engage HUD, the respective HUD offices early on to come up with a plan. No one-size-fits-all. You may or may not have to repay it all, but you just have to start thinking about it early on, and SAC's not going to approve an SVC plan if there is this outstanding unresolved debt that's tied to the units. Also start thinking about supportive services. If you have ROS and FSS and other supportive services programs attached to your units, think about the impact of the conversion on those programs, the residents, the grants. HUD has developed a really nice matrix. There's a link from this PowerPoint that talks about the implications. Some of the programs are only for public housing families and residents. Others can nicely move over to serve the same residents under the HCV program. So again, just start thinking about that early on if you do have these programs. Impact on existing public housing funds. So, you know, after the conversion, after the properties are released from DOT, you won't be able to spend any more public housing funds at the project. So you can continue to spend public housing funds, including, you know, public housing operating reserves, other money on the properties up through DOT release, if the project will continue, you know, but after DOT release, no more spending of the public housing funds. So again, as you consider the planning and timeline for your conversion, think about spending down your public housing funds prior to converting the property. Impact on future public housing funds. Voluntary conversions are not eligible for any additional operating funding through the asset repositioning fee or any future capital funding through demolition, disposition, or DDTF, demolition, disposition, transition funding. So public housing and operating funds are pretty much cut off at the time of conversion in the next funding cycle and DOT release, but that kind of makes sense since you're required to close out your public housing programs anyway. Public housing only PHAs are definitely eligible for streamlined voluntary conversion, but HUD's not going to award new HCV program funding to these public housing only PHAs. So what's required is these public housing only agencies to work with an HCV administrating agency for the TPV award. So HUD would fund the TPVs, but to a partnering HCV administrating agency. So there's some logistical details there, and HUD field office staff and other headquarters staff are available to help housing authorities facilitate those partnerships. And then finally, start thinking about your closeout options. You can just do a straight ACC termination under PH Notice 2019-13. Biggest advantage of this is it's really easy administratively. You know, you just do all the closeout requirements described in that notice, and then HUD terminates the ACC. The other thing you can do is think about transferring or consolidating your public housing program to another PHA, and this is particularly attractive to PHAs if a housing authority isn't able to spend down all their public housing funds prior to when they want to close out. And in this instance, they can transfer what's left of their public housing program. Even if they have no units or real property left, they can transfer any remaining public housing funds, including operating reserves, to another housing authority, and as well as any remaining fair cloth authority to another housing authority prior to closing out. So there's two big options to close out. Again, just kind of flagging that as a consideration as you start thinking whether this makes sense. Okay, so moving on to the next slide.
Yeah, so this is what we refer to it as the matrix or the asset repositioning overview, and it is available on our external HUD repositioning website. Just kind of Google asset repositioning overview if you can't locate it directly. But what we tried to do here is break down some of the most important elements that are considerations that housing authorities have under their various repositioning options into one handy chart. And I just think, I mean, it's something that you'd want to take a look at after you familiarize yourself with all the options. Just looking at it by itself, it might be a little overwhelming. But in case you're ever wondering, or you're having a conversation with your board or staff members, you know, what's the impact, the future impact on our housing authority if we do streamline versus going section, or, you know, or RAD on our eligibility for DDTF, or eligibility for ARP, this is kind of a quick way to get those answers in one location. And like I said, it's linked in our repositioning website, which is at the conclusion. We have a link to that at the conclusion of this presentation.
Great, thanks, Dan. Okay, the next slide. So we talked about a lot here, and the next couple slides are just a few kind of big picture slides about the different ways a streamlined voluntary conversion could play out with your housing authority. So the first one here, this slide, is if your goal is to truly voucher out, that you don't really want to preserve the property as affordable rental housing. You really just want to let the families take their vouchers, tenant-based vouchers, and find housing in the private market. So if that's the goal, definitely possible under streamlined voluntary conversion. Unlike RAD, there's no preservation, one-for-one replacement, anything like that. So a housing authority could propose a future use plan for the property that doesn't propose any kind of preservation or continued affordable housing use of the properties. And instead, they could say in their streamlined voluntary conversion plan, hey, what's in the best interest of the PHA, the residents, and the community is for us to remove all our public housing units from the program and get this new award of HCV through the tenant protection vouchers and voucher out, and this is good for my housing authority. We're going to have an expanded HCV program, more admin fee to administer that program, and, there's plenty of places where the families can use their HCV in our community. We don't have a tight market. Voucher utilization rates support this, and this could be one kind of scenario of how an SVC plan could work. In this instance, the future use of the property could be put a for sale sign out, sell at fair market value, take the proceeds to support your HCV program or use for other eligible Section 18 uses. Alternatively, maybe someone else, a developer or anyone, thinks that the property it would be great as continued affordable housing, and the housing authority is agreeable and amenable to selling it to another unrelated third party at below fair market value, so that other third party can use it for affordable housing. So, but again, this scenario is more the housing authority itself doesn't really want to stay involved in that property. They just want to be focused on their role as HCV administrator and protecting the families through tenant-based assistance. So this is kind of one huge bucket of how the SVC program could work. Next slide is, this is if a housing authority is interested in preserving the asset, and the asset's in great condition. In this instance, maybe no rehab, no new demo or reconstruction or redevelopment is necessary. Project's in good condition. SVC doesn't require any finding of obsolescence or anything like that. So here the housing authority could say, yep, converting the units from public housing to HCV makes sense, and preserving the asset as continued affordable housing makes sense. So I either want to retain it myself, or I want to sell it to an affiliated nonprofit, LLC, another entity, so the project can continue to be used as affordable housing for the long-term future. And here, again, the statutory right of the families to stay in their units with tenant-based assistance is triggered. PBV is possible and allowable with tenant consent that we discussed about. Here, the housing authority with an HCV program would assume the role as, would likely assume the role as the administrator of the HAP contract if the project is PBV'd. And then, some other entity would need to sign as project owner, either the nonprofit it controls or some contractual relationship if it retains. And again, like this kind of plan, again, could be in the best interest of the housing authority, the residents, and the community, because the property can now access private financing for long-term operation, maintenance, and upgrades. If there's excess cash flow, housing authority can use it to expand and further its other mission-related affordable housing purposes, whether that means acquiring, building, developing resident services, lots of flexibility and potentials there. I will add that the SVCs applications we've seen to date, and even the ones we've approved, I think are generally falling into this bucket. So this is one viable option. Going on to the next slide, another kind of scenario for how SVC could work for your housing authority is if your goal is to voucher out, preserve the asset with some kind of redevelopment. So this redevelopment could mean substantial rehab with tax credits. This redevelopment could mean demolition and new construction. And again, this is possible as a scenario under an SVC plan. It has some additional complications, especially, again, we mentioned this in the relocation slide a little bit, how the housing authority will fully protect the families during the redevelopment process, when those TPVs will be issued, if they're going to be issued initially as tenant-based assistance, and then the housing authority will develop after that, or if the housing authority is somehow going to try to preserve that initially, you know, convert and offer the families the ability to stay in their units and then do the redevelopment kind of in phases with temporary relocation or something like that. So there's different ways this could play out. Again, there's some internal discussion still going on for best practices involved with this kind of redevelopment, but I guess for today's purposes, we'll just mention this is one possible viable scenario for an SVC plan. And last slide on this, if your housing authority doesn't have an HCV program, any of the three things we just talked about are still viable and possible, but obviously if there's no HCV program, for the first one, for vouchering out, then the housing authority will in essence go away and in terms of its federal programming. And if there is preservation, then the public housing only agency would likely either just serve as the project owner, you know, and then the partnering agency would be the HCV administrator. So again, all these are possible scenarios, just more things to think through in terms of planning. Dan, pass it back to you.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, so I know we have quite a few questions in the queue, so I want to leave as much time as possible for that. But just these are links to resources, and like I said before, you know, repositioning at HUD.gov is a generic email box with a real person answering. So if you have any questions regarding this or other general repositioning questions, feel free to reach out there. And the SAC's email address is sacta@hud.gov. So, Kayla, why don't we just go right into questions? I know we had some from before and any new ones that might have popped up.
All right, yeah, let's do it. We have quite a few, so bear with me as I'm sort of sorting through them all. I'm going to start with one that came in earlier. Someone raised their hand, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute their line. Hi, Laura, you're unmuted and can ask your question.
Hi, I actually posed a question in the chat. I want to know, how does the 100% conversion requirement affect those units that currently have residents with TPVs planning to keep their vouchers as opposed to converting to project-based vouchers? Because I know you were stating that it has to be converted 100%.
Right, so all units need to be removed from the public housing program as part of a conversion plan. If the project will be retained as rental housing, then the family can choose to stay in their unit using tenant-based assistance. But HUD still considers that unit to be converted from public housing under the conversion plan because it's going to be removed from ACC and the public housing programming through PIC, even though the unit itself will be retained as affordable and the family will remain using tenant-based or project-based assistance.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks to both of you. Next question, would it be an accurate statement to say that a PHA with 50 units or less that wishes to demolish the property and redevelop might choose SBC over Section 18? Because under Section 18, the PHA would need to prove obsolescence to demolish the property.
Kayla, did they ask under 50 or under, Kayla, just clarify, did they ask under 50 or under 250? Because I think those are two very different questions.
Under 50, with 50 units or less.
Okay. Go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, so Dan, chime in here. So if a housing authority has under 50 units, then they are eligible to dispose under Section 18 just based on being a housing authority with a very small public housing program. If I'm understanding correctly, if this is a 50 and under PHA, but they want to demolish under Section 18 with capital funds, then I think I understand the concern that, yes, they would need HUD authority based on obsolescence under Section 18 to do the demolition, because the authority for very small PHAs under Section 18 is disposition and not demolition. So it sounds like if it's a 50 and under housing authority, the goal is demolition. The housing authority could submit under 18 and prove obsolescence, or sure, you could also be eligible to submit under Streamlined Voluntary Conversion. Your future use of the property could be demolition, and yeah, I mean, HUD, as part of the processing at the SAC, we would not necessarily need to apply, and we wouldn't necessarily apply the Section 18-970 demo obsolescence requirements at demolition plan, but we'd want to fully understand why the housing authority was to demolish the property under the voluntary conversion plan, as well as the totality of the future use. So, yeah, I don't know if that answered the question, but you could submit a Streamlined Voluntary Conversion plan that proposed demolition.
The major difference being under SBC, the vouchers go to the residents, and the residents can take those and leave with them, and it doesn't necessarily go to the housing authority. So that's something to consider. If they want, if the housing authority wants to redevelop, then they may want to keep those vouchers.
Okay, thanks. And James Isaacs is also here with us from the SAC. He asked me to unmute his line. James, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I'm just ready to chime in whenever Jane has to move on to her other call.
All right, sounds good. If you could go ahead and put yourself on mute while we get to the next questions, that would be great. So the next question is the requirement for HUD participation in tenant briefing just for Streamlined Voluntary Conversion? Can a recording of the briefing be used in lieu of HUD staff attendance?
So, yeah, generally the attendance of the field office at a family briefing is only in conjunction with voluntary conversions and only required when a housing authority is proposing to attach PBV assistance to the units and wants the tenants to consent. So under a Section 18 or other kind of action, tenant briefings and family briefings are not required. In terms of field office attendance, I think we need to read the appendix to the notice at face value. It indicates field office attendance is required, either in person or remotely. I don't know that a recording would suffice, but I think the SAC defers to the field offices to ensure that, to kind of make that call on in working with their local housing authorities.
All right, thanks. If the resident wants to move out of state, does the PHA still pay moving costs?
So this is, there's some local discretion here. Again, we're back to the term actual and reasonable relocation expenses. So a housing authority has the local discretion to determine if an out-of-state move and the cost of that out-of-state move is a reasonable expense. Clearly, if it's cost incurred, they're actual, but the housing authority can choose not to pay for those expenses if it deems them to be unreasonable. So, for instance, if a housing authority and a family lives in New York and the family wants to move to Hawaii and wants the family or the housing authority to pay those moving expenses, the housing authority could say those aren't reasonable and they would not be statutorily obligated to pay.
All right, thanks. If we only have one public housing unit left, then the resident participation requirement is just with the single family, correct? Not with all of our RAD residents and HCV residents, correct?
Correct. So under Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, you would need to consult with the impacted resident, so that family, and then if there's a resident council at the development, which it sounds like there's not. So those would be the consultation requirements. No requirement to consult with HCV residents and no requirement to consult with the RAB, the Resident Advisory Board under a Streamlined Voluntary Conversion.
Okay, thanks. Sorry for that feedback there. That happened a few minutes ago. That was as we were adding James on, we got some feedback. So hopefully everyone can hear us pretty clearly now. Let me move on to the next question. 1 second. You guys have been sending a lot of great questions, so I'm gonna make sure I get all of them. Okay. So what does mobility counseling entail?
I think it's, again, local discretion, case by case. I think there's more guidance through the HCV program on what appropriate mobility counseling may be. Under Section 22, the statutory requirement is to provide any necessary counseling. Again, generally, we think of that as mobility counseling, but it could be other counseling. Section 22 and 972 aren't specific in what's required there, so I encourage you to reach out to your field office, HCV resources that discuss more about mobility counseling. I don't know if anyone else from HUD or anywhere else can add to that.
All right, hearing nothing, I'll move on to the next question. Is the conversion a quote unquote go to sleep one night and wake up with housing choice vouchers, or can the conversion be done over an extended period of time, for example, 30?
What was it, for example, 30 what?
30 days.
Yeah, at 30 days seems reasonable. So yeah, I mean, the conversion is not going to happen instantaneously unless every single family opts to stay in the project using tenant-based or project-based assistance. In that instance, conceivably, all the families could be converted from public housing to Section 8 through the 50058 on the same day, but more often than not, some families are going to choose to move off-site with the tenant-based assistance. That might be the only option if the project isn't going to be used as affordable housing, but even if it's not the only option, it's likely some families are going to choose to move. And in that case, then the conversion of the families is going to happen over a reasonable time frame. So as after HUD approves the conversion and the family applies for and receives the tenant protection voucher award, they can issue the notification to families that here's a TPV, you have tenant-based assistance, you can move off-site, we'll pay your moving expenses, we'll provide mobility counseling, we'll help you find a unit. So over the next 90 days, the housing authority can work with the family to help them find a private unit off-site if that's the family's preferred housing of choice. And as the families find units, the families will move from public housing to HCV through the 50058, and that is the quote-unquote conversion of the families from public housing to tenant-based assistance. And so, you know, again, with off-site relocation, the conversion isn't of all families is very unlikely to happen on the same day. And then if when a property will remain as affordable rental housing for any families that choose to remain, then conceivably those families can be converted on the same day after the other families have moved off site. And the order of operations document kind of outlines these steps of how the conversion could look, kind of how I just described.
All right, thanks. Next question, how many SVC conversions have occurred to date?
I don't know that any have been fully implemented. Jane, I defer to you or James. I think the SAC has approved maybe 4 or 5 at this point.
And that's pretty much it. We got a few in the queue ready to go. I think another 2 or 3 waiting for approval from headquarters.
Great. So how fast is HUD headquarters approving an HCV application for TPV from submission to executed ACC?
So after STAC approves the Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, Housing Authority can apply for TPVs. The application is submitted to the field office. The field office kind of does a due diligence review and then sends it on to the FMC or FMD for funding and approval. I think generally it's occurring within 2 to 3 weeks or 2 to 4 weeks, provided the TPV application and leasing schedule and everything is complete. But I don't know if anyone has more experience, but I think it's generally within at least a month that the TPVs get funded, oftentimes less.
All right. Next question, is HUD considering modifying the PVV process for PHAs who are partnering with another PHA to act as the contract administrator? For many small public housing only PHAs, the uncertainty around the need to respond to a competitive RFP by a CA makes SVC a lot less appealing, and many PHAs do not want to share ownership in order to not have to utilize the competitive process. Any thoughts?
Dan, I defer to you or James, but my understanding is, you know, this might be a question to bring up as part of the PPV webinar in a couple weeks. My understanding is HUD is also willing to entertain waivers of the competition requirement in this instance for good cause, and this could be a good cause that HUD would grant such a waiver for. Dan, James, if you have any more to add on that for the time being.
No, I think that's it, and I think this is something that should come up as part of the PVV presentation.
All right, thanks. I have a question from someone who wants to unmute their line, so I'm going to go scroll down and find them. Naomi, you can ask your question.
Hi, Jane, Kathy, it's Naomi. Thanks for having a great webinar. It's good to talk to you. I was actually the one that asked the question about the competitive process. When you mentioned the waiver, is that something else that needs to be discussed during the PBV webinar? You know, as someone who's actually worked with the Housing Authority to successfully submit an SVC application, this has been a big concern for a lot of housing authorities, but if this is not the right time to discuss the waiver that they could request, I could definitely wait till the next session.
Yeah, I think it would be better to wait for the next session, given it's a PVV requirement, and that office would be processing and reviewing the waiver request. I would defer to that office in terms of what would be a good cause to grant the waiver and those kind of details.
Okay, will do. Thanks.
All right, thanks, everybody. The next question, oh, not a question, just someone commenting on the great asset repositioning chart. So next one. So a phased SBC over 24 to 30 months for 3 properties does not allow DDTF or asset repositioning fee to be acquired from the first development being removed from the ACC to use at the second and third property. What CSP? Can you remove the first property but still get CSP funds until all units are converted and the ACC versus the DOT alone being terminated? I know that was a big one, so if you need me to repeat it, happy to do so.
I'll break it down and let me know if I'm missing some of it. So in terms of the first part of the question, correct. Like if you are not eligible to receive DDTF or ARF for any kind of phases of the dispositions or demolitions that are proposed under an SVC plan. So even if the Housing Authority has 3 separate sites and doing different phased sequential demolitions, dispositions on all sites, they cannot get DDTF and ARF for the first site in order to use them, you know, in general until they're done with everything. Nothing approved under an SVC code and PIC is going to be eligible for DDTF or ARF. In terms of when your current public housing operating and capital funds get kind of shut off, this will depend on largely when the units go into RMI status and PIC. So in the instance where you would be doing a phased sequential implementation of a SVC plan, we would work with you probably to establish the application under 3 DDA numbers and PIC, and our notice 2018-04 kind of describes how to do a phased DDA application through PIC with multiple DDA numbers. The principal reason here is so Housing Authority can come up with different timelines for each site. So different timelines for the relocation, different timelines for when they're going to enter into the disposition or demolition contract for each site. So in the instance where you'd have different DDAs for each site, different DDA applications in PIC, you could create different relocation starts and different dates where the projects would go into RMI status. And the OP and CAP funds for each project would, in essence, could be shut off differently for each site depending on that timeline. So it's possible for a later site, later on then in the sequential process, to continue to be eligible for ongoing OP and CAP sub because those units aren't in RMI yet, whereas an earlier project would no longer be eligible for OP and CAP in the next funding cycle because they're now in RMI status. So I think I answered your question with as much of a mouthful as the question itself, but hopefully let me know if that didn't address it.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. For the person who asked that question, if you need any additional information, just send me a chat. The next one that we have in the queue is, in states that permit benefit corporations as a corporate form, may a project be transferred to a benefit corporation as opposed to a related nonprofit or LLC?
Could you repeat that one more time?
Sure. So in states that permit benefit corporations as a corporate form, may a project be transferred to a benefit corporation as opposed to a related nonprofit or LLC?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not that familiar with that kind of entity, but, you know, there's no real restrictions on the kind of future use or disposition a property could go to under an SVC plan. So it would just, the Housing Authority would just need to describe the nature of the acquiring entity, and if it's a below fair market value transfer, then, you know, again, what the commensurate public benefit would be in the future use of transferring it to that entity.
I would just point out that what the SAC will be looking for is whether that entity is recognized as a separate entity in your state. All right, so the one thing that is a red flag for us is for you to just not convey to somebody else. So, so if a benefits corporation, whatever that is recognized as a separate entity in your state, then it more than likely will be approvable.
All right, sounds good. Next question. Our public housing and HCV programs are run by two different housing authorities. The PHA running the HCV program currently does not have any PBV. If they are unwilling or not, excuse me, interested in administering PBV, but only TBA, then can we not offer that as an option for tenants to give consent to convert to PBRA? In other words, does the HCV administrator control that decision?
So the Streamlined Voluntary Conversion will allow HUD to provide tenant protection vouchers, and tenant protection vouchers can only be project-based through PBV and not PBRA. So I guess I'm a little confused how we would get from the tenant protection voucher award to the administrating agency to any possible PBRA.
I think, Kathy, just to clarify, I think what they're saying is that I don't think they were talking about switching to multifamily. I think the question is that the voucher administrator does not want to operate a PBV program, right? And so who is the initial PHA, the PHA undergoing the conversion, can they not convert to PBV? Must they do tenant? Must they provide those families tenant protection vouchers in the form of, you know, TPVs as opposed to PBVs because of that administrating agency's unwillingness to PBV? In other words, who gets to make the call?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's kind of a mutual thing. So if it's a public housing only agency and they want to proceed with a voluntary, streamlined voluntary conversion plan, and again, these are all voluntary applications, HUD's not requiring any housing authority to submit these applications, then, you know, because they don't have the ability to get those TPVs themselves and create a PBV program, they would either have to find a HCV agency. If the goal of the public housing only agency was to serve as project owner and PBV the site, and they really wanted to PBV it, then they would need to find an HCV administrating agency that was willing to operate a PBV program and be the contract administrator of that site. And if they want to partner with a particular HCV agency that is unwilling to operate a PBV program, then yeah, then they would have to be comfortable with an SVC plan that would propose only tenant-based assistance. Now remember, they could continue to operate the same project as project owner as an affordable rental housing project, and all the families would have the option to stay in place using tenant-based assistance. So they would still get that HCV rent, fair market rent, maybe not 110% like under the PBV program they allow, but they could still operate the project as affordable rental housing and accept HCV tenant-based assistance, and it might work out just fine. In fact, one of the approvals we've done so far, the Housing Authority's controlled nonprofit is doing just that. They're going to continue to operate the project as affordable rental housing, accepting tenant-based assistance, but have no plans to PBV it. So, you know, I think the two options for that Housing Authority would be just get comfortable with retaining the property as affordable housing, accepting tenant-based assistance, or find another HCV agency that is willing to have a PBV program and work with the Housing Authority to PBV that asset.
All right, thanks. Can a PHA utilize other owned non-PHA property to place project-based vouchers?
Yes. This could be an option for relocation. So, for instance, if Housing Authority does not plan to use the current project as rental housing after the conversion, and instead says, but I have this other really great project across town, and I want to take my entire TPV award and project-based voucher this other project with that TPV award. And I'm going to say to all the families, I'm offering you comparable housing in the form of a PBV lease across town in this particular unit. The Housing Authority could conceivably do that under an SVC plan as a relocation option. To clarify, the families only have the right to tenant-based mobility assistance, the statutory right to tenant-based mobility assistance, if the same public housing project is going to be used as rental housing. If the Housing Authority is truly going to walk from that current site and not continue to use it as affordable rental housing, and they have this other site across town, they could say to the families, I'm going to pay for your moving expenses, but it's only to this PBV unit. This is your form of comparable housing. I think with Streamlined Voluntary Conversion definitely encourages housing authorities to give a tenant-based option, mobility option to use in the private market in the community, but it's only statutorily required if the same site is going to be used as affordable rental housing.
All right. So next question. Could you review the language under 3 key points about SVC that states the TPV is issued for units occupied by an assisted family within the past 24 months? What is the tenant given if they have not resided for 24 months and you are converting the property with plans to continue managing the property for affordable housing? And I think this was on one of the first slides, so can begin answering and I'll try and find that.
Yeah,
right. I recall that.
I can take it, Kathy. I think what you're asking, it doesn't need to be continuously occupied for 24 months. It means that an assisted family, any assisted family, would have needed to have resided in the unit for the PHA to be eligible to receive these TPVs. So if a family moves in 1 month before SVC approval, that family is eligible for a TPV. That they would receive a TPV and the PHA would receive the TPV. Does that clarify?
Right. I also want to emphasize that there's two things going on. One is the TPV award that the Housing Authority is eligible for. So a Housing Authority is eligible to receive TPVs for any unit occupied by an assisted family within the previous 24 months, even if the families occupying those particular units might not be eligible for the tenant protection voucher themselves. So for instance, if you have 40 units and all 40 units are occupied, but 2 are over-occupied by over-income families, you would be eligible to get 40 tenant protection vouchers, but for 2 of those tenant protection vouchers, you wouldn't be able to give those to the over-income families because the over-income families themselves do not qualify for HCV assistance. So for those 2 families, you would have to offer and provide another form of comparable housing, and then you could just take the TPVs from your TPV award and use them for families on your wait list or to PPV or to do other eligible HCV things with them. So I just want to make the distinction. Two separate things going on. You're eligible for TPVs for occupied units, units occupied within the previous 24 months, but separately you need to offer relocation and comparable housing to every family, even if those families aren't eligible for the TPVs.
All right, thanks. We've got about 13 minutes left, so I'll just keep chugging along. I think we have about 4 questions left. So first, if our county voucher agency doesn't want to administer the PBVs, can I go to the neighboring county that is willing to administer?
Yes. What the SAC is going to look for is the field office to concur and approve that agreement between the PHA-only agency and the administrating agency. Field office might look for things like capacity and just the ability, but as long as the field office is good with it, then yeah, and there's the jurisdictional ability, then they can go to any HCV agency they want to.
All right, thanks. Next question, if a tenant refuses to allow the unit to be project-based, does it become project-based upon the resident moving out?
That's definitely an option. So if a family chooses to so these things can happen. If the family chooses to leave and take the mobility option with the PHA paying the moving expenses and move off-site, the Housing Authority could immediately PBV that unit using its existing HCV resources. If a family chooses to stay in their unit using tenant-based assistance, and then after 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, chooses to leave with that tenant-based assistance after a few years, then yeah, the Housing Authority could add that vacated unit to HAP at that time when the tenant leaves. Alternatively, maybe after a year, the family might say, oh yeah, there's no real advantage to staying here with tenant-based assistance. I really like my unit. I'm agreeable to a PBV lease now. So either when the tenant moves out or later consents to a PBV lease, the unit could be added to HAP. And this might get covered a little more in the webinar on PBV in a couple weeks, but I also note that 5-year requirement, so the HOTMA allows a former public housing property to be exempt from the PBV agency caps, the 20% agency caps, if the units are added to HAP within 5 years from being public housing. So in order to take advantage of that HOTMA exemption and 5-year ability to PBV outside of the cap, you know, the family would have to move out or consent to the PBV lease within that 5-year period from conversion. So if the family stayed in their unit with tenant-based assistance for 6 years and then moved out, the housing authority could still add that unit to HAP at that time, but it wouldn't be able to tap into that 5-year HOPMA exemption to be over the 20% cap.
All right, next question. If the use remains rental affordable housing and substantial rehabilitation is planned, are we to expect 2 relocations as a part of the SBC process? One to transfer assistance from public housing to TPV, and a second in the actual relocation during construction?
So, great question, and this is kind of where we kind of pinged that redevelopment concern. When a redevelopment is planned as part of a streamlined voluntary conversion, these are the exact kind of questions that you need to consider. At the time of the conversion, families need to be offered and provided with permanent comparable housing under Section 18. So either tenant-based assistance to move off-site, or tenant-based or project-based assistance in their current units. If the current units will maybe stay affordable rental housing for a few years while the housing authority is planning and securing financing for a redevelopment, perhaps. If redevelopment and rehab, substantial rehab or demo new construction is pending, then it's possible also that the housing authority could say your permanent housing, you know, we're going to offer you the ability to come back to a redeveloped PBV unit, but, you know, I think in that instance, unless the housing authority has a thorough temporary relocation plan, it would be better to just offer the family tenant-based assistance and to PBV on site with existing HCV resources, unless there's the relocation budget for temporary relocation. So these are issues, I think, that need to be thought through. I think the key thing to take away is, again, for purposes of Section 22, at the time of the conversion, families should be offered permanent comparable housing, tenant-based assistance, project-based assistance. And then later on, if they're offered tenant-based assistance and the housing authority wants to give the family the ability to return to a redeveloped PBV unit, they can offer the family that as a voluntary option, but the family would not be obligated to accept that PBV or return, and the housing authority would not be obligated to offer it.
All right, thanks. So how does the PHA avoid having a unit under Section 9 ACC but with an HCV? Is that not statutorily prohibited, statutorily? Or do the changes in 50058 move that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the magic moment of the conversion. So if the project will continue to be used as affordable rental housing, as outlined in the SVC order of operations, there'll be kind of this magic moment where for any family who chooses to remain at the project using tenant-based assistance, those families will get moved from on the 50058 from public housing, and they'll get EOP'd in public housing, and they'll go under the 50058 in the HCV program. HUD will release the DOT. The units will go into RMI status. So at no moment will the unit be both public housing and HCV. There'll be a magic moment where, boom, they're converted. The families, the property, everything goes from public housing to the HCV platform.
All right, and we're coming up on time, so I think we have enough time for maybe one more, and I think that's all I'm seeing in my queue right now. This is just a question about clarifying the timeline. So first, submit the plan to the SAC, 90 days for review and approval, then another month to TPV funding, approximately 4 months total.
Okay, I'll qualify the SAC review a little bit. So under 972, SAC is required to, or HUD is required to respond to a submitted SVC plan within 90 days. We're not required to approve or disapprove or issue a final decision within 90 days. So we could ask for additional clarifying information, more supporting documentation. We definitely need to respond to the application submitted within 90 days, but and I think the goal is to issue a final approval within 90 days. But Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you know, it's not an absolute that HUD's going to complete its review within 90 days.
That's correct. What we typically do is we get the assignment, we give it to a reviewer starts looking at it, and when the reviewer will compile their questions and eventually send you an email or a letter saying, this is the additional information we need. So that interim letter or email is that compliance with communicating with the housing authority within the 90 days. We have typically completed our reviews within 60 days. Sometimes because of the complexity and the issues that need to be resolved, it may take a little longer to process, or it may take a little longer to get it signed by headquarters. This application type is the one application type that the SAC does not sign itself.
Okay, thanks. So one final question for others who maybe had a question that they didn't get to answer or that comes in, you know, after, feel free to send me an email and I can pass it along and you can get your question answered that way. But to close this out, will the Housing Authority's FFY change for any reason as a result of conversion?
Will the Housing Authority's what? What was that again?
I think they're asking fiscal year end. No, the approval of Streamlined Voluntary Conversion wouldn't impact your fiscal year end. PHA can change their fiscal year end, but that's a totally separate process from this.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And then I'll pass it over to you to close this out really quick.
Oh, that's it. I honestly just want to thank Kathy for James and Jane for doing such a great job answering all those questions today and laying this out, and for all the great questions that came in. I think we had a lot of clarification on a lot of good questions. So thanks everyone for joining, and look forward to hearing from everyone and seeing everyone at our next Wednesday webinar.
And just as a reminder, you'll get a little pop-up to complete a survey after this, and we really appreciate it if you fill that out. So everybody enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.